Hello, everyone. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passion World Talk Radio Network, a subsidiary of Global Media Network, LLC. Our mantra is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. The views of the guest may not represent those of the host of the station. Folks, I'm excited, as always, to bring you a phenomenal guest, and I'm so glad that I get to interview various authors, writers about different subjects. And today's guest wrote a very interesting book called The Jailer's Reckoning, How Mass Incarceration is Damaging America by Kevin B. Smith. Kevin B. Smith has been studying and teaching state politics and policy for more than 20 years. He has authored or co-authored 9 books, including Predisposed, Liberals, Conservatives, and the Biology of Political Differences. Prior to life in academia, he covered state and local politics as a newspaper reporter. Kevin B. Smith is a Leland and Dorothy H. Olson Chair, Political Science, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I want to welcome Kevin B. Smith to Chatting with Betsy.
Oh, thank you for the invitation, Betsy. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I am happy that you are here, and I have to tell you, in reading this book, I thought about where I did used to work, where there was prisoners, like I was told you before recording, and it was like a paint in place from what I heard from like years ago. And I just am going to start off with what made you decide to write this book, which is phenomenal, folks. You have to get it.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that sort of prompted me to write this. I mean, one, it has been a prominent issue at the local and state level for a very long time, and it's been an issue that I've had, some personal interest in, because you mentioned that I used to be a journalist, and one of the things that I used to cover was crime in the criminal justice system, and I sort of saw that operate in several states and several large cities. And I'd also done some research on this, as an academic. And as part of that research, I mean, one of the things that became really apparent to me is that not just that the United States locks up a phenomenal number of its own citizens, which it does compared to other countries, but that there's a huge variation between states. Most people who are sitting in prison are sitting in a state penitentiary, and states have hugely different incarceration rates. And I was wondering whether the differences, if you could explain the differences between why, say, like Maine has a low incarceration rate and Louisiana has a high incarceration rate, could that help lead to an explanation of why we engage in kind of like this 40-year-long social experiment of depriving millions upon millions of citizens of their liberty?
I found, Kevin, that your book was very enlightening to me, because I really did not know the information that you have put in your book, which is why I suggest people to read it, especially if you're going into criminal justice. I would highly recommend this book to read. Why is there a difference between state to state? I live in New Jersey, so I don't know what the rate is here in New Jersey, but why is there such a difference?
Yeah, I don't think there's a single answer to that. I mean, I've, crunched a lot of numbers at the state level looking at the variation of incarceration rates, and I think there's a number of potential explanations. I mean, an obvious one is different rates of violent crime. One of the explanations is differences in racial and ethnic diversity. But there's also one of the differences that seems to make a big difference is just public attitudes, sort of like, how punitive are public attitudes towards, criminal actions in different states. And you get, some pretty surprising differences, among the states. Some states' public opinion tends to lean towards being more supportive of, the rehabilitation side of incarceration, and some states, the public opinion is much more along the lines of, hey, you did the crime, you do the time, no ifs and buts, and don't expect much help when you get out. And one of the things that I've found is that the state criminal justice system tends to reflect public opinion in those instances.
I agree with you. I think there has to be a better way when someone who has served time should be able to be rehabilitated and given a chance to work, but it seems like it's what you call a catch-22, Kevin. People don't want to hire people who have committed a crime. It's very hard to find employment, especially if you did a federal crime or a violent crime. I don't know what the answer is to that, of how do you get people back into the system to work and to support them.
Yeah, that's a completely accurate observation, Betsy. And I think it's, I sort of hesitate to say this, but I think it's also true. I think it's even worse than you made it out to be, because there are some programs and initiatives that operate within prisons that, train inmates to acquire economically valuable skill sets. So, you have broken the law, but while you're in prison, you learn a trade or you learn a skill, and then you get outside. And the theory is that you should be able to, put your life on a pretty positive trajectory by going and selling that skill or trade in the labor market. But for an ex-convict, that can be tough to do, because having sort of like a felony conviction on your resume, automatically is a strike against you for many employers. And in some cases, you may even be legally barred from, applying the skill set that you've learned. One of the examples that I use in the book is the state of California trains a number of its prisoners to become firefighters. They fight wildfires in California, in part using inmate labor. And some of those inmates, develop a passion for that. They get a sense of satisfaction out of doing that kind of work. And there's a demand for firefighters in certain states, especially in the sense of fighting fires, especially in western states. And yet in some cases, governments are barred from hiring these people because they have felony records. So, I'm not sure what the solution is, but the problem is definitely there, Betsy, and I think it's an even bigger problem than your comment suggested, unfortunately.
So you give the story of Shawna Jones, who was doing the firefighting and who died. I don't understand, these people are trained, and it's unfortunate that Shawna died. Why can't they be employed? And, the different states, they are using the prisoners as cheap labor, which, they're learning a skill, then they should be, I feel, in my opinion, should be able to get a job in that field. And it's unfortunate. I know someone, actually a very good friend of mine, her son served some time in prison, drug charges, and he can't find a job other than working at a gas station.
Yeah, that is, I think, an all too common story. I think that the primary reason why, people are sort of declared ineligible or have a hard time getting jobs is that there's a basic conundrum in the sense that, if you're competing for a job in the labor market, there's in a lot of states there's a general attitude. Public opinion is essentially, If you have committed a crime, you should have no built-in advantage over someone who has always been an upstanding and law-abiding citizen. And that sort of attitude, I think, acts as a disincentive to, the political system to sort of like try to break down any sort of like barriers to employment that ex-convicts face. And lacking those incentives and those barriers staying up, it simply means that the problem keeps repeating itself. I mean, people get out, they have a hard time getting a job. If you look at recidivism rates, the same old story is that, they return to committing criminal acts, they go back to prison, and the cycle starts over again.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, Kevin, I worked in a state facility, and a lot of people there had relatives in prison. And they would tell me, Betsy, people actually, when they get out of prison, especially if it's in the wintertime, they'll commit a crime to go back in so they can have a place to live and 3 meals a day because they can't find employment.
Yeah, absolutely. Those stories are not uncommon. And, some people, like, for example, they get out and they're required to see a parole officer. Their parole officer lives on the other side of a metroplex, and they literally do not have the resources to transport themselves from where they're living, their residence, to their parole officer, and they can sort of like have a parole violation and end up back in prison. The recidivism rates are in the United States are just extraordinarily high. I mean, there's a lot of variation from state to state, but a reasonable estimate would be that 50% of people who are released are back in the criminal justice system within a year or two.
Yeah, it's like it's a repeated cycle until there's going to be some kind of a support system once people get out of prison. And I think like a lot of people in prison, I mean, I'm not a social worker, I don't have a degree in criminal justice or anything, but I think a lot of people now who are in prison due to drug charges, and depending on what that is, they should be pardoned. They should be released. Marijuana is legal now. And
right.
I think that they should be, let go and have a job. Have them work in the marijuana industry. If that's what they like, have them open up a place, to sell marijuana legally.
I think part of the issue with the lack of support in terms of, helping people re-enter the general population and get their lives on a positive track is that requires resources, basically spending money. And I want to be careful what I say here because there are some programs and some people out there who are doing just a great job, often in very resource-constrained environments, in helping, people coming out of prison get a job and get on their feet, find a place to live, help with transportation, all of those things. But, I mean, I think any way you cut it, there's not enough resources going into those programs to make it, those programs sort of like be generally successful in terms of most people coming out of prison not ending back up in prison. And the problem for the lack of resources is essentially political. If you are a legislator, you're running for office and you're saying, vote for me because what I'm going to do is vote to increase the budget to help people getting out of prisons, that's not an electoral winner. Convicted criminals just are not a particularly powerful or persuasive constituency. And it's really easy to take a position of, we don't want to do anything that is going to send taxpayer money towards helping these people who have broken the rules. And unfortunately, one of the consequences of that is you have a lot of people coming out of prison being released into the general population with real minimal support and, in all honesty, pretty minimal chances of successfully reintegrating.
I have to share a story, Kevin. When I worked as a nurse in the state institution for the mentally disabled, and I'm pretty, I was pretty naive back then. And one of the nurses, my coworker, she told me, she says, that so-and-so was a hitman for the mob. And I said, no, I didn't know that. I mean, this guy was a nice-looking man, very nice, and I could not picture him, being a murderer. He just didn't seem that way. And a matter of fact, he was so kind when I was going to have surgery. He took my hand and he said, Betsy, you're going to be okay, and I'll be praying for you. I mean, he was so nice. I was floored when I heard about the crimes that he committed. I mean, so he was rehabilitated, this man. He worked for the state for years being a direct care. And, he was giving back to society. And I think that should be what, to me, that's what should happen.
I think that prison populations or ex-prison populations, what you see in them is the same amount of variation in terms of, conscientiousness, empathy, goodwill to others than you see in a general population. Are the people who commit, violent crimes, are there people who repeatedly engage in acts of social predation, and should those people be locked away? Yes, absolutely. But if you look at the size of the prison populations in the United States, I mean, we've clearly got to figure out something other than just sort of like warehousing people, and we've got to do that not even necessarily for them, but for us, for those of us who are never going to experience, any sort of direct contact with the criminal justice system. We pay in a number of ways for the size of the sheer number of people that we're locking up.
Yes, it costs quite a bit of money to keep someone in prison.
In terms of money, we pay the equivalent of the annual budget of the United States Marine Corps every year to lock people up. But it's not just money. We are locking so many people up now, it's having macroeconomic effects. It affects the unemployment rate. It acts as a drag on gross domestic product. It is demonstrably having a negative effect on social capital at the community and at the state level. And increasingly, with felony disenfranchisement and with the disincentive to participate civically that comes with experience with the criminal justice system, it's actually starting to influence election outcomes. So there's just a whole range of ways in which mass incarceration is affecting all of us that I don't think too many people are fully aware of.
Can I have to ask you this question? Because I always wanted to know, and you're the man to answer. I never knew why people in prison are not allowed to vote. Why is that right taken away from them?
I think that's just sort of like a historical thing where, the basic argument is if you have broken society's rules, society has a legitimate interest in saying you cannot participate in making those rules until you've either served your punishment and made good with society, and or you have proven that you can do that for a certain amount of time.
So when they when prisoners, they served their time, then they had their right to vote again?
It depends upon the state. With some states, you have permanent disenfranchisement. If you're convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote forever. In some states, you get the right to vote back as soon as you serve your sentence. And in some states, there's sort of like a probationary period after which you can apply to get your rights reinstated. And so it varies from state to state. And even in states that technically don't have felony disenfranchisement, you can still effectively, de facto be barred from voting. And the poster child for that is the state of Florida. The state of Florida used to have complete felony disenfranchisement. You lose your voting rights for life. They passed a constitutional amendment and a ballot initiative restoring franchise rights. And then the legislature passed a law saying you can only have those rights once you've paid all court costs that are associated with your sentencing and your penal servitude. And those costs are prohibitive enough that a lot of people who are convicted felons just basically don't pay them. And so they're technically still disenfranchised. They legally can't vote.
That's a lot of people that can't vote, Kevin.
It is indeed. And 2024, in the most recent presidential election, there were over 4 million citizens who were legally barred from voting because of felony disenfranchisement.
Over 4 million?
Over 4 million.
Wow. That is over 4 million votes, people. That's mind-boggling to me.
Well, and that doesn't include the fact that people who serve prison sentences, and there's been quite a bit of study on that actually serves as a socialization process. And one of the things it socializes people towards is not participating civically. If you serve a prison sentence, you're much less likely to vote, even if you are eligible to vote. And turnout rates amongst ex-prisoners are really low. I mean, a high-end estimate is 30 to 35% turnout amongst that population.
Wow, that's incredible. I have to ask you this, Kevin. The story about Larry Dayries, am I pronouncing his name right?
Yeah, Larry Dayries.
Dayries, yes, the tuna fish sandwich, that he got a sentence of 70 years because that was his third time arrested. I mean, that sounds like bizarre to serve 70 years for stealing a tuna fish sandwich. I mean, that is a waste of taxpayer money, if you ask me.
And I used and that is an extreme example, but it's a really useful one. And the basic story here was he walked into a Whole Foods in Austin, Texas, and picked up a tuna fish sandwich from the deli counter and walked out without paying for it, and was confronted by a store safety officer outside. And the upshot of it was he was sentenced to 70 years because Texas is a 3-strike state. And the lowest estimate that I could get of what that is going to cost the taxpayers of the state of Texas is $1.1 million. If he serves half of his sentence, which is about the earliest he could get out, the earliest he could get parole, and you take the absolute rock bottom lowest per inmate cost in the state of Texas, it's going to cost the Texas taxpayers well over $1 million to keep him incarcerated. And, looking at that example, that's, I use that as a metaphor, and I call it the tuna fish sandwich test, which is kind of like a cost-benefit view of things is it really worth it to the taxpayers to spend that much money to keep a guy in prison for a tuna fish sandwich? I mean, is there another way we could have better spent that $1 million, or even a lot less than that $1 million, and sort of like put people like Larry Dayries on a more positive trajectory? And it seems to me that there are a number of opportunities to at least think through, how could we better use the resources that we're using to lock people up to get a more beneficial outcome, not just for them, and I keep emphasizing this in the book, but also for us, because, locking people up isn't cheap. You lock someone up for 5 or 10 years, you severely constrain their economic opportunities when they get out. And in some ways, for some people, prison effectively functions as a finishing school for criminals. And, is this really what we want to do? Are there other options? Are there ways that we can, approach these problems without locking up so many people?
Yeah, that seemed a little harsh. I know when I worked in retail, we weren't even allowed to accuse anyone or approach anyone if we saw them stealing. We would say, "Oh, I see you're admiring, that body lotion. Would you like the shower gel to go along with it?" I mean, we were told you don't confront anybody. So I was really shocked when I, when reading your book, that this man was charged such an extreme sentence, even if it was his third strike. I mean, it's only a tuna fish sandwich. There's worse crimes to be, locked up for. Have you found, Kevin, that it depends on who does the crime and who they do it to about how long their sentence is?
There's some research out there that suggests that, African-American males especially are more likely to get longer sentences. There's some conflicting research on whether that is because of, things like prior records. It is 100% the case that it is not just a question of what you do, but where you do it that goes a long way to determining whether you will go to prison, and if you go to prison, for how long you go to prison. I mean, if Larry Dayries had stolen a lobster roll from a deli in Maine or Massachusetts, I seriously doubt he would have gone to prison. And if he did go to prison, it wouldn't have been for 70 years.
Yeah, that's very true. I have to tell you this story. This is why I asked this question. I think sometimes it depends who you do the crime to. There was a father and son that went to our church. The father accidentally killed somebody. He served 18 months. His son broke into someone's house that's in politics. Maybe he was a councilman or something in the town. He served 6 years for breaking into a house. So I wonder if that also plays into it. Like Saran, who killed Robert R.F.K. Sr., served a very, very long time. And then some people commit murder, and they're out in 5 years, it seems like. So,
well, I mean, there might be something to that, for the simple fact that the primary form of prosecutors in the United States, district attorneys, those are overwhelmingly an elected position. And the people who hand out the sentences, the people who are convicted of crimes, who are overwhelmingly state court judges and courts of original jurisdiction, those are both elected positions. And, the people in those elected positions will say, I make my decisions without fear or favor, and I don't pay any attention to what the voters want. And there's a lot of research that suggests if you have an elected position, if you're an elected DA or if you're an elected state judge, you are pretty darn responsive to public opinion and your electoral constituency. So if a crime is committed against a prominent person in the community, which is, it's big news and there's a lot of people paying attention to it, I think you better believe that both the prosecutor and the state judge are well aware of that and behave at least partially in response to it.
I also have to ask you, Kevin, what are the worst ways that this mass incarceration is hurting the country? And why is the U.S. incarcerating more people than anywhere else? I know that's a twofold question.
Yeah, I think the worst way, it is harming us, socially, economically, and politically. But honestly, if I had to pick one thing and say this is the most concerning impact that mass incarceration is having on us, its contribution to the erosion of social trust and social cohesion. We have such a massive ex-prisoner population right now that it is starting to sort of like really pull apart, the bonds of trust at the community level. And the most obvious example of this is some inner city neighborhoods where, unfortunately, there's something of a revolving door between the community and the criminal justice system. But some of those communities are really, really sort of like fraying. And you're starting to be able to detect this not just at the community level, but at the state level. As to why the United States locks up more people than other countries, I think that actually is the wrong question. It's why do some states lock up more people than other countries? Because some states, their incarceration rates are actually, they might be a little higher, but they're not outrageously higher than, countries like Germany or the UK or Canada. While other states have incarceration rates that, you're talking Angola or Venezuela or China or Russia. And the differences between states in that particular category, the big difference is violent crime. Parts of the United States are, compared to other Western liberal democracies, pretty violent places.
Well, thank you for answering that. Are you familiar, Kevin, with Merle Haggard, the legendary country music star?
Oh, yeah. I remember Merle Haggard.
Yes, and he was in prison, San Quentin. He heard Johnny Cash perform there. And, in a lot of his songs, he talks about, being a branded man, and he wanted to just live his life and go on, but people remind him, you were in prison, and he became, very successful. He happened to be very talented, and it's just that he changed his life. But he couldn't afford a lawyer. And I think a lot of people end up going to jail because they don't have the money for the best lawyers that other people who have the means to pay for the lawyers.
I think that's 100% correct. If you have the resources to hire a talented, focused, and dedicated criminal defense attorney, you're in much better shape than if you are assigned an underpaid, overworked public defender with a ridiculously long caseload. And a lot of people end up, it's not even convictions, they plead guilty. A lot of criminal charges, the sentencing is actually worked out in plea deals. So it's not even like there was a trial.
You are very interesting to talk to, Kevin. I bet your career, when you would investigate crime, had to be pretty fascinating, but also a little morbid. I used to watch a lot of IDTV, in investigating the murders, which I found very interesting. My husband would say to me, "Why are you watching that?" But I found it very interesting, solving the crimes.
Yeah, I found that the part of my career when I was a journalist and I was looking into that sort of thing, I found it fascinating, but it was also kind of like, it was also depressing. You got to see a view of humanity that was not the best side of humanity. Let me put it like that.
That's true.
I covered. I worked for the Kansas City Star in the mid-1980s when the crack epidemic was really taking off. And, there was, oh my gosh, there's some really sad stories there. And then a little later on in the later 80s, early 90s, one of the things that I covered was crime in East St. Louis, which at the time was the murder capital of the United States. And that really sort of like gives you kind of an insight that I'm not sure that a lot of people have in the sense that if you're living a reasonably, middle-class life, it's hard to comprehend, what is going on in those communities. One of the things that always shocked me, Betsy, was not that you found a lot of criminal activity in those communities. One of the things that fascinated me was that there were so many just normal, regular people who came out of those communities. And, especially if you were a young man where there's not a lot of job opportunities, the school system isn't great, there's not a ton of family structure, the public institutions are breaking down around you. The fact that so many of them came out of that sort of environment where they had every excuse to take sort of like a negative path and didn't, that was one of the things that I was always, if there was a silver lining there, that's how I took it.
I'm sure that had to be, you're right, fascinating, and you get to see the bad side of mankind, the sad, depressing. Yeah. Why don't you like the readers? I know there's a lot of things to take away from your excellent book. What's one thing you would like, or you can mention two things, whatever you'd like, what you would like the reader to take away from your book?
Oh, the key thing that I want people to take away is that the problem of mass incarceration is not a problem of us and them. The key thing I want readers to take away and understand why is that it's just us. That there really is no them in the sense of this is a problem we all have to own because it is affecting every one of us.
Thank you. I thought your book is excellent, Kevin B. Smith. Where can people purchase your book?
It's available on Amazon.com. It's available on, BarnesandNoble.com. Basically anywhere you can buy a book from a big bookseller, it's there.
And how can people get in touch with you?
The easiest way to get in touch with me is just to go to my website. There's sort of like a contact form out there, and my website is easy to remember. It's kevinbsmith.com. KEVIN.
Oh, that's easy.
Yeah, BSMITH.com. Yeah.
That is very easy. I have to tell you, Kevin B. Smith, I really enjoyed reading your book. It really gave me a lot to think about, and I found it fascinating, and I just want to tell the audience I highly recommend it, especially if you're going into social work, criminal justice, just to learn about what is going on in our criminal justice system. Please read The Jailer's Reckoning, How Mass Incarceration is Damaging America. Just a fascinating book, and I think that your students are very fortunate to have you teach them, Kevin. I think I could sit in the classroom of you teaching for a long time. You're very interesting to talk to. So thank you for educating us, for educating the next generation, and I wish you the best of luck with your book.
Well, thank you so much, Betsy, and I enjoyed the conversation, and I appreciate the invitation.
Oh, you are welcome. You're welcome to come back anytime. You're writing another book. Just let me know. I just really, sometimes a topic in a book, and it's like, oh, you know what? How am I going to like reading that? And that's one of the things I really love about being a host is I get to read, I get myself educated. And just really, I learned a lot from your book, and it really was eye-opening. And I think about the people, that I worked with and people that had relatives in jail and, what they went through and how, my son's friend who served time for drugs cannot get a job other than at a gas station. And it's just not fair. So things need to change in our society, that's for sure. And I think your book does a great job in bringing that out. Excuse me. Well, thank you so much, Kevin B. Smith. I enjoyed having you on, enjoyed chatting with you. Folks, all the information, about Kevin B. Smith will be in the blog that Jeannie White, who's the station manager, writes. And Jeannie produces the show. And I want to thank Lillian Caldwell, who is CEO of Pastoral Talk Radio Network, who makes this all possible. And I want to thank you, the listeners. Please share the show. Please subscribe. It's for free on Spotify, Spreaker, Amazon Music, to name just a few. Folks, have an open mind. Don't let your mind close. Oh, it's about prisoners. I'm not going to read it. I don't want to read it. Read this book, because I'm telling you, it will open up your eyes and it will give you a different view of the criminal justice system and what's going on. And it gave me a different view. So I'm very glad that I read it, and I'm very glad that Kevin B. Smith wrote this. And I really highly recommend people to read it. Go to wherever you want to order the book. Can they order it from your website, Kevin, or just go to the bookstore?
Yeah, they can just go to Amazon.com or whatever, but if they go to my website, there is a place there where you can order it, even order it direct from the publisher.
Oh, okay. And, folks, if you want to follow me, I'm on Facebook, Betsy Wurzel, W-R-Z-E-L. And if you need a support group, I have hashtag Kick Alzheimer's Ass Movement. And as I always say at the end of my show, in a world where you could be anything, please be kind and shine your light bright, because we need it now more than ever before. And let's bring back our humanity and start being kind to each other and stop judging each other and give people a chance. There's a lot of people coming out of prison that want a chance. How about we give them a chance to enter society, to have a job, to be successful? And I think that's what America needs to work on, or each state needs to work on. Things need to change. So once again, I thank you, Kevin B. Smith, for opening up my eyes and the world when they read this book. And I want to thank everyone for listening again. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Pastoral World Talk Radio Network, a subsidiary of Global Media Network, LLC. Bye-bye now.